Am I on? All right. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. We need that mic close, remember. Get ready, I'm going to have some volunteers during this. So, anyways, let's just first start off by acknowledging that great companies are not built off of a product, business model, and financial projections alone, right? I'm talking to the choir here, right? Like, people really are a company's most valuable and, frankly, most expensive asset. But I continue to be so surprised by how many companies don't have a people plan, let alone a culture plan, in place to really maximize that investment. And you know, it also surprises me, and sorry if some of you in the crowd fall into this thinking, but this belief that culture just happens. It just naturally happens, right? And it does, but not great cultures. Great cultures, you actually have to make them happen, okay? I need to change slides, I think, here. There we go. Peter Drucker famously says, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." Whoa, that's provocative, isn't it? Culture eats strategy for breakfast. But what the heck does culture mean? And what do you actually do with it, right? You know, so what many companies tend to do in really good intentions is they write values, integrity, teamwork, collaboration, respect, and they put them on a wall, maybe on your mouse pad, maybe pinned on your desk, right? They say, look, we've defined our culture. This is what we care about. But as we've all been reminded recently, what we say is not necessarily true, let alone real, all the time, right? Words are just words, and they don't make culture. I can also tell you, after being with Amazon for over 8 years, dogs don't make culture, ping pong tables don't make culture, free lunches, happy hours, perks, that does not make culture, okay? So it's easy to say what culture isn't, right? It's pretty easy. And it's much harder to articulate what culture is. And so I'm going to have us do a little bit of an exercise at your seats, so don't be intimidated. And I'm going to have everyone close your eyes. And please engage with me on this, because I'm going to take you down a moment of reflection for a few minutes. As you have your eyes closed, I want you to think about the last big decision you had to make at your company. And I want you to think about what was influencing that decision. Was it how your boss would react? Maybe an influential leader? Would that person be impressed? Or were you thinking about your customer or a key stakeholder? And now I want you to think about, as you started to develop that plan, were you developing that plan based on what would be the easiest or fastest thing? What would deliver results tomorrow or over the long term? Or maybe what benefited your individual job? Or maybe your team as a whole? And my last question for you before you open your eyes that I want you to ponder is, was there any tension in making that decision before it was done? So you can go ahead and open your eyes. And let's pretend we're all one company for a moment. And if I were to pull everything out of your minds, and I made it visible, let's put it visible up on the wall for everyone to see, and we actually mapped all the patterns that we could identify between the things that were driving your decision process and the things that were influencing your thinking, that would be the beginning of culture. That would be the beginning of how we define culture. And so, we did this. So I'm going to take a stance and say, as a starting point, culture is an evolving shared mental model for how we make decisions, interact with each other, and deliver value to our customers. But that's still heavy, right? That's still hard to remember and articulate. So now we're going to do the activity I alluded to earlier. I'm looking for 3 volunteers. I won't turn down 4. 3 volunteers to help us take this a step further. And I'll introduce what the expectation is. Love the enthusiasm in the back. Please come up. I'm looking for at least 2 more. And what I'm going to ask you to do is we're going to pretend there's a 5-year-old right here. Okay? And to this 5-year-old, you have to actually tell them what culture is. What does it mean in a way that they can understand it. Okay? I need a couple more before we get started. Yeah, thank you. Come on up. Thank you. Come on up. 4. Boom, boom. All right. Love the enthusiasm of this room. Come on up. Yeah, thank you. And here, join me. Join me on stage. Yeah. All right. There, I'm kind of, relatively speaking, the height here of a 5-year-old.
And I'm supposed to define culture?
Yep, define culture, to a 5-year-old.
Culture for you would be when you're in your class with Charlie and Sarah, and how you actually feel when you come into the room. So do you gravitate to your close friends? Do you gravitate to your teacher? What are the things that make you happy? And if you feel happy in that environment, then that's part of your culture, and how do you want to interact with that?
Yeah, awesome.
That came off top of it.
Yeah, let's give her a round of applause. Thank you, thank you.
Okay, little Timmy. Culture is that thing inside you that tells you about what it is you're trying to make a decision about. So it's the thing that tells you whether or not what you're about to do is the right thing to do, or maybe not the right thing to do.
Yeah, thank you, thank you, thank you.
So I think culture would mean to you is how you feel when you come to accomplish something. Say it's something you want to do, what you want to color, how does that drive you every day?
Nice, thank you. Number 5, 4.
Culture is the example that we follow for how we treat one another.
Yeah?
Simple as that.
Simple as that. All right, awesome. Okay, I'll let you guys go back to your seats. Thank you so much for that. All right, thank you so much, courageous volunteers. All right, so now I'm going to have us take stock of ourselves for a second. No judgment, no hurt feelings. I want you with your hand raised to tell us when they were speaking, who of you in the audience were thinking, good job, oh, you nailed it, great job. How many of you were thinking that? Awesome. Okay? And so if we took for a moment and we pretended we were all one company and we all had that same mindset, right? We can think about, gosh, if we all had that attitude, how much would we push ourselves? How realistic would we be with each other? How would we raise the bar constantly to keep up? Okay? On the flip side, I want to raise some hands. Who's the critical one in the bunch? Like, ooh, man, that's not right. Or shoot, I should have gone up there. I think I had a better definition. Yeah, show me the raise of hands. Let's be honest in the room, all right? And if that was the attitude of our company, how would that affect really our tolerance for risk, our willingness to put ourselves out there and expose a mistake and therefore learn from it, right? Our real sense of innovation, it would be affected. And so one thing I just want to portray is we all take a position. We have a bias towards something in any given scenario, right? And it's really the combination of all of our attitudes and reactions in that moment that hopefully result, for a great company, hopefully result in encouraging and supportive and critical and continuing to push the status quo. So The other thing I want to articulate before we move on is this: within culture, you might have, let's say, the people you see as being quote-unquote responsible for culture. That might be your HR person, your people ops person, your CEO, your leadership team. And through this exercise, I also want to make sure that it's demonstrated that you, every single day, moment to moment, based on how you are reacting, interacting, and making decisions, you are actually shaping the culture of your organization. So, after working in the nonprofit sector, moving to Amazon for just over 8 years, I ultimately decided to join a startup. And I'm leading people operations at this startup, and it's one of the fastest growing in Seattle, where really 10x is the normal, right? Not the exception. And I have a real emphasis in my work on building culture and building a high-performing organization that can sustain, that's scale-ready, that people actually want to be a part of over time. And so what I'm here today to do for the rest of our time together is really walk through what's the in-progress playbook for building a culture in your organization and taking it into the future. And really reminding you throughout that culture really is a competitive advantage for your company. So we've broken this up into 3 main work streams, one of which is define it, which is really understanding what is your culture today and what does it need to become for you to hit your goals as a company. Build it, which is about formalizing it, and then ultimately living it, which is about ingraining it into the organization. So it's just the way that people do things. It's the way that they interact. It's the way that they make decisions. And ultimately, it's the way that they treat customers, and the brand of the company is ultimately perceived by the public. Okay, so we'll start with define it. And in this define it phase, especially for early stage companies, you know, like I said, I'm with a fast growing startup. Especially for early stage companies, really the company reflects the co-founder and CEO more than anything else. And so it's important for you to really analyze and really pay attention to the personality, the strengths, and the weaknesses of that CEO or that co-founding team. And you know, you can think about it, if you can reflect in your own scenarios. If the co-founder is really competitive, it's likely a more aggressive organization. If they're more data-driven, you know, or metrics-based, they're probably making metrics-based decisions as a company. If they're emotional, impulsive, the company is often taking that on, and what employees might feel is actually a distribution of focus rather than a single focus. If they have a hard time making decisions in the moment, growth and actually taking a deliberate stance is harder and harder. You see my point here, right? A company often reflects the founder or CEO. So first you need to analyze really that person and what is it that they are demonstrating and therefore eliciting from the company. And then you expand your study. And what you're looking at is the real broad set of employees. What I did is I interviewed everyone in the company one-on-one. And interviewing is a whole different workshop that I can get into a lot of detail, but just know I left a resource in this slide deck that you can tap into later and leverage. But what you're trying to elicit out of those interviews is really from the most tenured person to the person that is literally weeks in role, what is their experience within the culture of your company? What's working and what's not working? What are the drivers and barriers that you're able to identify by identifying the patterns among these discussions? And then as a third step, what you would be doing is saying, okay, I have a bunch of qualitative information, right? I analyzed, paid close attention to the CEO, co-founding team. I've talked to everybody in the company. I'm starting to identify some patterns. But you know, just to make sure that the information is as objective as it can be and your bias isn't creeping in, I recommend a culture survey. A validation survey is often what I refer to it as, to make sure that what you have pulled out is either validated or invalidated, and whatever you're presenting forward, you can actually say, hey, bringing these two data sets together, this is the story. These are the drivers and barriers of our organization, and this is who we are today. So this is what you're going to see. I'm going to clip through these, but this is in the deck after the session, which gives you 3 slides of how you go about planning, executing, and debriefing interviews to lead to a study if that's something that you choose to do. And so, a moment of reflection for a second, again at your tables with your notebook. I just want you to write down where you are, based on where your organization is at, what is one action step that you can do to better define your company culture? All right. The next section, build it. So we've now have a sense of who we are as a culture and company and how we need to evolve in order to meet our company goals. And now it's time to start building it. And first, I recommend writing your future story. You know, one thing that I really valued and learned at Amazon, and I hope the whole world reads about and continues to try to model, is this idea of the press release or the working backwards method, where you actually articulate the future state of a product, and then you articulate it in a way as if it became available to the world. What do we want them to say about it? And then you work backwards from there. And so you can apply that same sort of concept to culture. And you could write a story, a one-pager, a press release about how fast company might talk about your culture in 2 years. And that's kind of your vision document. And then you can call them values or principles, but ultimately the way I think about it is it's the framework of the culture based on everything that you've learned. And so what are the guiding principles of the organization? And when you write these, it's not things like teamwork and integrity and collaboration, right? It's the language of the business. It's things that will roll off the tongue in everyday conversation and meetings. In some cases, it's the thing that somebody can beat the table with and say out loud. So it's articulated in the language of the company that represents the culture. It's clear to people internally and externally. And since it is meant to guide decisions, going back to our earlier point, you may actually want to introduce tension in some of these. So that way you force more deliberate thinking, especially when you're in a high-stakes decision process for the company or you're moving into a new vertical. And lastly, build a roadmap. This is like a product plan, a business plan. What are the tangible things that you're going to do to actually bring this to life for every level of the organization and at every step of the employee journey? Similar to interviews, values and writing values can be its own workshop. So again, I've just left you with some tips for how to think about writing values when it's time. So another quick minute. Again, wherever you are at as a company, think about someone on the leadership team that might be, if it's not you, that might be actually a culture champion for you and how you might be able to engage them. Okay, now live it, the final stage that we talked about earlier. If you really are trying to build culture, you're going to have to exert influence across many parts of the organization to make it come to life. And so, again, I'm going to just talk about my experience here. And if you want to talk about your own experience later and brainstorm around that, I'm happy to do that after this session. But one of the first audiences you'll have to actually influence is the board, CEO, co-founders, the leadership team. And what you really need from them is you need them to prioritize this. And the way that I got them to prioritize it is I spoke at a board meeting, the first board meeting I was in attendance at, and I said, this is the work that we did. So pretty much what I did in define it. This is what we found. You can see there's a lot of yellow and red here. This is the potential risk and impact to the business. And this is what we need to do to move forward. And so you're piercing reality, you're creating urgency, and you're giving them the path so that they can see what we need to do and how they fit into it. And so you have to prioritize it, commit to monitoring it, and ultimately get them to communicate the importance and reinforce that importance all the time. This is not something that you talk about once. You don't talk about values once and then say, okay, we've got them, right? It's reinforced in many parts of the organization, which we'll go through shortly. Managers. This is something that I have a way of thinking about solving for the least common denominator. And that's what I mean by anchor. You anchor the cultural principles all around the manager. So they don't have to remember to talk about things. It's actually a systems thing. They have to talk about your core values and evaluate against them. And again, in the next slide, I'll get to what that is. But you train them on what good looks like, and then you anchor them into hiring, performance management, goal setting, feedback conversations, promotional documents, so that they can't escape them. They can't be forgotten. They're actually surrounded in the ecosystem. And then ultimately you measure through upward feedback and culture surveys, and you tell them where they're performing and where they're not performing, meaning demonstrating the culture that you're trying to move the organization to. And then ultimately there's the individuals, the masses. And so the way that we're doing this is we're engaging folks into what we call culture committee or culture club, culture guild is actually the language that they're using at Amperity. And it's made up of a diverse set of employees and a cross-section of employees across the company that come together on a weekly basis. I started it every 2 weeks. They wanted to move it to weekly, so that's what we're doing. And so I love the enthusiasm. And in that, there's two main things that they're doing. Number one, they're just sharing. They're sharing what they're hearing, what they're experiencing, and thinking together how to iterate on that insight. And then also, they are really pushing the management team to evolve in the way that the company needs. And they're actually building recommendations that the management team is embracing, such as the format of any interactions, our Monday meetings, our demos, what our company meetings look like, communications that go out virtually. And they're actually informing and guiding the management team on how to think about those interaction points as a way of reinforcing culture. And then lastly, we're celebrating it. So we don't just celebrate output, we actually celebrate output plus how that links to a value. So, Greg did X, and that was an awesome build for durability moment, right? Sammy did Y, and man, that was a great example of play for each other. And these are done publicly, both in our Slack channel and in our Monday meetings where we exchange kudos during that time. And so as I mentioned earlier, living it at every stage, I'm going to just give you one quick idea. And again, these are things we can talk about offline. But this is what you want to do is you want to wrap the system in the cultural principles that you're trying to drive towards. And so in recruiting, having an interview question bank that actually has questions that an interviewer can ask that represents each of the values, and having those as assigned competencies in the interview process and explicitly discussed in the debrief when determining quote-unquote fit, okay? You're making hiring decision based on that. You're onboarding them, and you're actually putting people into a training not just for job function, but actually for culture, and getting them assimilated in the organization, getting their mental model aligned to ours, and really thinking about the language that we use and how they use it. Goal setting and performance. This is actually not just an individual thing for us. Our company level goals are tied directly to one of our core values. And so we have, let's say, 5 goals that all map to build for durability as one of our core values as an example, and I can explain more of that later. But you can do that on a company level all the way to an individual level. What is it that you are trying to accomplish for the company that connects to one of our cultural principles? And then performance, evaluating them not just on what they do, but how they do it, similar to what I had talked about earlier, and promoting with that same mentality, showing next level capability functionally and next level capability from a values or principle set as it relates to culture. And so again, this is the last point of reflection, to just write down right now, what is the most impactful way that you can start to anchor culture in your organization? All right. Awkward. The thing to just acknowledge is change is the new normal, right? That's in business, technology, and people. Culture is not a fixed thing. In fact, things that if you were to walk away and put in place today, in a year or 2 years, you might look back and think, in partnership with whatever team you're working with, say, you know that thing we decided on last year or 2 years ago? You know, that's just not really relevant for us anymore. Or you might say, you know that thing we decided on 2 years ago? We drifted. And actually it is important, and we need to figure out how to get us back there. And the whole point is, yes, things will change, and it's really up to you and your teams to make it happen. So, thank you. Do I stay here?
Awesome. We do have some questions, Mary, if you stay on stage. But that was great. Those are my takeaways.
Okay.
You can have them if you'd like. No, I really liked just the conversation about ping pong, dogs, free snacks, all those things don't make culture. And I was sitting there thinking, TINYpulse, check, check, check.
They enhance it, though.
They enhance it,
They
absolutely.
enhance the experience, yeah.
And also just how the definition of culture changes and needing to have that change resiliency and being able to kind of go with that. I think back to when I was in college and selfies weren't even a thing. And now I can't imagine a day where, well, I don't take a selfie with my cats. That was an awkward moment. All right, let's check out the questions here. So you talk about introducing tension in establishing your values. Can you expand on this?
Yeah. Oh, I guess I have a microphone. Yeah, so you will commonly see companies take a certain position, for example, move quickly and break things, or move fast and break things. Do you know who that represents? Facebook. That's the thing that they index towards. Ford indexes more towards building what's strong and will last over the long term. And this is actually an area where you see a lot of tension. And so this is one example I'm going to use. So deciding on tension is really helping an employee make a decision about, are they building for the long term, or are they figuring out the short-term solution right now? That's tension and values that has to result in a more deliberate decision depending on what it is that they're facing. So ours is build for durability and make something better today. Those two things and the subtext within them are in direct tension with each other. It's thinking 10x and designing for 10x, or just moving quickly and stepping up and doing the patchwork that needs done today. And it's up to an employee to decide what the right thing is in that moment. At Amazon, if you ever read their leadership principles, there's lots of tension all over them. Bias for action and dive deep. Think big and invent and simplify. It's design tension that guides decision making, and an employee has to make a decision based on the context that they're working in, which is again guided by those principles. Is that helpful?
Yeah. Well, I can speak for the heads nodding in the room. Another one that was popular. We've been hearing culture never sleeps quite a bit this week. Are there any repeatable, habitual things you suggest that we can do to make great culture sustainable?
Yeah, I guess before I answer that question, did anything jump out in the presentation? And if the answer is no, that's okay. Did anyone catch anything that's like, hey, we should be doing this to reinforce sustainable culture? Yep. Is that what I heard? Anchoring around managers? Anything else? So that actually, oh, go ahead. Yeah. Yeah. So thank you. The one I was first going to go to was exactly the first thing that was said, which is anchoring, right? And so if you're instilling your values or your principles, the way you expect people to operate, if you actually put those in every part of your performance and business goal setting processes, so talent management and business goals, if you put it in all of those and it becomes a part of the total ecosystem, people can't escape it. right? I mean, it's constantly reinforced through the processes and systems that are in place. In addition to that, to your point of influencing every part of the organization, I would take that a step further to say influencing, holding them accountable to really behaving in a way that the culture expects, right, based on what your new definition of the culture is, and communicating it all the time through storytelling. Use the mechanisms that you have in place, weekly meetings, like I said, newsletters, team meetings, in addition to the goal setting and people processes, to just talk about culture and the importance of it and the values and how those are coming to life.
All right, one more. I love how you shared the playbook and it gave some kind of step-by-step process and gave us something real. And one of the questions that came in was, how do you get buy-in from leadership or your cultural values, on your cultural values, if you don't have a seat at the table? So if you don't get invited to that board meeting, what would you recommend?
Yeah. The board was not a required part, but it's helpful. So I'll respond to first my approach, in that as a fast-growing startup, the board is also very much overseeing how the culture is evolving. Depending on the stage of your company, the highest level you may need to influence will be the senior leadership team. And so again, we can talk about your own scenarios. And the way that you might do it, depending on where you're at in the organization, is first understanding what drives them. So this gets back to the earlier comment. Ideally, data. Hopefully, data drives them. And so you can help to guide some initiatives around really evaluating the health of the culture, and again, what's driving it and what are the barriers of progress in order to hit the goals. And if not that, then we need to think about what else drives them. Is it more of the emotional stories, the customer stories, right? Okay, so then how do you leverage employee stories in order to move them? Okay, and so first understanding how do you influence that individual at the top and then the leadership team. And depending on where you're at in the organization, you might have to leverage, your level of influence might have to actually be broader, where you have to leverage your own manager or find a champion that's maybe a skip level in another part of the organization and start to work the system of influence to get to the level that you need to, because culture does start at the top in a way, right? You can move it from the bottom, but if the people up above are not embodying it, it's going to get shortcut every time. So again, if you put that question out and you want to talk through your own scenario with me, I'm again going to stay after this and we can talk through that.